Hi everyone, welcome to our Human Origins Today hot topic webinar. So we're really excited this month to have with us Dr. Matt Tocheri, who I will introduce in a moment. But first, I just want to tell you a little bit about how this webinar will work. Also, my name is Briana Pobiner, and I am a paleoanthropologist and educator in the Smithsonian's Human Origins program. So we have these webinars once a month. And they always focus on a hot, exciting topic in human evolution. So the way this webinar will work is that I will introduce our speaker, Dr. Matt Tocheri. He will share his screen and run through a presentation. I will turn my camera and my video off. And then when Matt is finished, I will come back on and I will facilitate a question and answer session with Matt based on the questions that you type into the Q&A. So you can see either at the top or the bottom of your screen, these two little speech bubbles that say Q&A. That's where you can type in questions for Matt during the presentation. During his presentation, I will also be behind the scenes answering any of those questions that I'm able to answer, but a lot of them we will save for Matt for the end of the presentation when he's done. So he'll spend about 20 or 30 minutes during this hour-long presentation, during this hour-long event, giving his presentation, and then the rest of the time will be a question and answer session. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Matt Tocheri to turn on his camera, and I will introduce him. Hey, Matt. So Dr. Matt Tocheri is the Canada Research Chair in Human Origins at Lakehead University, which is in Thunder Bay, Ontario. He's also a research associate in the Smithsonian's Human Origins program, and he's an associate investigator of the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. He received his PhD in anthropology from Arizona State University in 2007, and he was elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2013. His research focuses on the evolutionary history and functional morphology of the human and great ape family, with a special interest in Homo floresiensis, the so-called Hobbits of human evolution. And that's exactly what he's going to be talking about today. And it's especially nice for me to welcome Matt back since he was a member of the Human Origins program team for several years. So Matt, feel free to turn on your microphone and share your screen and take it away. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks, Briana. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, looks great.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. It's so great to be back here for the Hot Topics. I always enjoyed taking part in these events when I lived in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, and I'm super excited to do this again, this time with you all virtually, direct from my home, as Briana said, in way up north in Thunder Bay, Canada, which is about a 6-hour drive north of Minneapolis, Minnesota. So, okay, let's get started, shall we? Okay, well, as Canada Research Chair in Human Origins, I explore the many connections between humans and the natural world in a variety of ways through my research program, which focuses broadly on increasing and diffusing knowledge about human and great ape evolution. Now, the biological connections among all living people are absolutely astonishing. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. It doesn't matter what languages you might speak. And it certainly doesn't matter where you trace your family history, whether that might be Africa, Asia, the Americas, Europe, Australia, or some other fabulous place in between. All of us are about 99.9% genetically identical with every other living person on the planet today. Encoded deep within our almost identical DNAs is the history of how we, as a species, originated in Africa roughly 300,000 to 400,000 years ago, and how all people of recent non-African descent are the direct descendants of small populations that dispersed from Africa within the past 50,000 to maybe 70,000 years. As a species, Our closest living relatives are chimpanzees, which include two species that survive today in the rainforests, woodlands, and savannas of Central Africa. Shown here is a mother and infant of one of these species, known as the common chimpanzee, or Pan troglodytes. Less familiar to the public is the other living species of chimpanzee, the bonobos, or Pan paniscus. Bonobo and common chimpanzee populations have been evolving separately from one another for more than 1 million years, ever since the formation of the Congo River. Now, on average, 98.8% of our DNA is an exact identical match with the DNA of chimpanzees and bonobos. And there is a long list of other striking connections between the three of us that are present in our anatomy, as well as in the complex ways we behave. Chimpanzees and bonobos are about 99.6% genetically identical to one another. So they are actually more genetically diverse than all humans living today. And that raises some really interesting questions. Why are there two species of chimpanzees, but only one species of humans? And why is human genetic diversity so low? The answers to these questions are understandably complex. But basically, not that long ago, around 50,000 years ago or so, humans were more diverse. For example, the complete genomes of Neanderthals and their close relatives, the Denisovans, show that their DNA is 99.7% identical to ours. The three of us share a common ancestry that traces back to Africa about 800,000 years ago, when a small part of that ancestral African population dispersed into Eurasia, and after which the connections with African populations were soon lost. Those that survived in East and South Asia evolved into Denisovans. Those in Europe and Western Asia evolved into Neanderthals. And those populations that remained in Africa evolved into us. And yet, the past 20 years of discoveries in the field of human evolution have revealed that these three very closely related human groups were also not alone. Other, even more distantly related human species were still surviving in pockets across the old world throughout the past 1 million years. In South Africa, we have Homo naledi, thought to have gone extinct within the past 300,000 to 400,000 years. In Central Java, Indonesia, we have Homo erectus, thought to have gone extinct just before 100,000 years ago. In the Philippines, we have Homo luzonensis, thought to have gone extinct at least 50,000 years ago. And on the Indonesian island of Flores, we have Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of human evolution, and the species which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about today. As Tolkien wrote long ago in his famous book, The Hobbit, there is nothing like looking if you want to find something. You certainly find something if you look, but it is not always quite the something you were after. So far, Homo floresiensis is known only from Flores, an oceanic island that is wedged between the southeastern continental shelf of Asia on one side and Australia on the other. Even at times of low sea levels in the past, Flores has never been connected by land to either of these continents. Their ancestors appear to have arrived on the island at least 1 million years ago, and they are last seen about 50,000 years ago here at this place called Liangbua, a magnificent limestone cave that preserves a relatively continuous stratigraphic record of the past 200,000 years. Its limestone structure maintains an extremely comfortable ambient temperature throughout the year, You walk outside of the cave here, and within about 30 seconds, you are hot, sweaty, and uncomfortable. Whereas inside this cave, you feel like you are in a perfectly temperature-controlled building. It's no wonder that it contains such dense accumulation of bones and artifacts, as people and other animals have been looking forward to spending all or at least part of their day here for countless millennia. First discovered in the early 2000s, the skeletal evidence so far indicates Homo floresiensis adults stood about 1 meter tall and weighed about 60 pounds. Based on measurements of the most complete skeleton, often referred to as Liangbua 1 or LB1 for short. The height estimate is based on the length measurement of LB1's thigh bone, or the femur, while the weight estimate is based on the various joint sizes of LB1's leg bones. Even more shocking than the small body size, the brain of LB1 was only about 400 cubic centimeters, which is about 1/3 the size of those of humans living today. In this case, the inner bone surface of the skull is what is used to reconstruct the volume of the brain. And as I'm sure you can imagine, when this discovery was first announced to the world on the 28th of October, 2004, these hobbits suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the councils of the wise and the great. Now, I am neither Tolkien himself, nor am I or was I ever part of the councils of the wise and the great, but my friends still tease me relentlessly to this day, because right after the first time I read these 2004 Nature papers about Homo floresiensis while I was a graduate student, on what was probably the morning of the 29th of October, I think, I just looked up from the pages and said, wow, what a wonderful time to be alive. But we have learned a great deal more about this enigmatic hominin species over the past 17 years or so. And not everything has turned out as spectacular as originally thought. At the time of discovery, Homo floresiensis remains were dated to as recent as 18 or even 13,000 years ago, using the charcoal samples recovered where you see these green stars in relation to where LB1 was found back here. However, as excavations continued at the site, it became clear that the stratigraphy, that is the way all of these different layers of sediments relate to one another, was more complicated than initially presumed. It became clear that all of these sediments here are resting immediately above a much older pedestal of deposits, the very top of which has a carbon date of 46,000 years ago, shown here by this red star. This means that all of the Homo floresiensis skeletal remains are about 100,000 to 60,000 years old, while stone artifacts attributed to this species at Liangbua are roughly between 190,000 and 50,000 years old. Here is a more detailed look at what is going on here, including the relative positions of 8 volcanic tephras that were critical for figuring out what had happened. Here we can see we have the skeletal and cultural remains of Homo floresiensis buried within this pedestal of older deposits. The front of which has eroded away, resulting in a steeply sloping surface to the north. This entire surface was then subsequently covered by the younger sediments over the past 20 to 30,000 years. Homo floresiensis was also originally reported to have made and used sophisticated stone tools as well as even fire. However, further studies have shown that the stone tools are broadly similar to the kinds of tools that are first seen about 2.5 million years ago in East Africa, and that are subsequently found at fossil sites throughout Africa and Asia. Modern humans at Liangbua also made and used very similar kinds of stone tools as Homo floresiensis up until quite recently. And the main distinctions between these two hominin toolkits are that modern humans at Liangbua show a preference for using chert, a sedimentary rock known for its predictability during stone flaking. And roughly 18% of these modern human artifacts show some exposure to fire. Whereas Homo floresiensis shows a preference for using silicified tuff, which is a volcanic rock that is abundant on the landscape surrounding Liangbua. And the evidence for intentional use of fire is negligible at best. Indeed, continued excavations at the site have yet to uncover any clear evidence of intentional burning within the Homo floresiensis layers. Micromorphological analysis of sediments throughout the site's stratigraphy shows that hearth and hearth-like structures first occur in sediments around 41,000 and 24,000 years ago, and are almost certainly the result of modern human behavior. It appears that the evidence for burning previously attributed to Homo floresiensis when it was discovered was due to misinterpreting the stratigraphy and applying burning events that occurred roughly 20,000 to 12,000 years ago to this extinct hominin. And Homo floresiensis survived alongside an interesting group of animals that included a cow-sized elephant, giant marabou stork, vulture, Komodo dragon, and even giant rats, until 50,000 years ago, that is, when all of these taxa, except for the rats, mysteriously vanish from the sediments preserved at Liangbua. From head to toe, Homo floresiensis displays a unique combination of ancient and evolved human features that distinguishes it from Homo sapiens and all other extinct human species, and reveals anatomy that was otherwise thought to have disappeared 2 to 3 million years ago within the evolving human family tree. In many ways, from the neck down, it closely resembles Australopiths, like the famous Lucy skeleton from 3 million years ago in East Africa. But in other important ways, particularly in its face, teeth, and jaws, it displays features that are shared only among species that belong to the genus Homo, the same genus to which our species belongs. Its skeleton reveals that it was unquestionably well adapted to walking on 2 legs. However, compared to us, their legs are proportionately short, while their feet are proportionately long, indicating that they were likely much better climbers and much less efficient runners than we are. For example, the proportions between different parts of the body in living great apes and humans are closely associated with their specific locomotor behaviors. Orangutans are almost exclusively arboreal, spending around 95% of their time in the trees, and their long arms relative to their legs reflect this behavioral specialization. In contrast, modern humans have long legs relative to their arms, reflecting an evolutionary commitment to walking on the ground on 2 legs. The body proportions of extinct human species like Homo floresiensis help us to reconstruct their locomotor repertoires. In Homo floresiensis and Lucy, the thigh bone, or the femur, is slightly longer than the upper arm bone, or the humerus, suggesting that these 2 extinct human species may have shared a similar locomotor repertoire that included walking on the ground on 2 legs, but also probably involved a significant amount of climbing. The length of the foot relative to leg length also reveals key information about locomotor adaptations. Proportionately longer feet are also beneficial for climbing, and not surprisingly, all living great apes have long feet relative to their femur length, especially orangutans. In contrast, proportionally shorter feet are beneficial for moving on the ground, especially at higher speeds, As bipeds with feet about half the length of our femurs, modern humans are well adapted to both walking and running on the ground. However, as a biped with feet about 67% the length of the femur, Homo floresiensis was well adapted to walking and climbing, but not running. In total, all of the evidence to date suggests that Homo floresiensis represents the descendants of an even earlier dispersal of hominins from Africa that probably occurred sometime between 1.5 and 3 million years ago, long before there was anything like modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, and more than likely, well before their shared common ancestor had even evolved. Exactly how closely related we are to hobbits remains an open question. All 4 of these human species are more closely related to each other than any is to living chimpanzees. But hobbits undoubtedly preserve ancient parts of the human genome that have long since disappeared entirely in humans living today. In that respect, if their DNA is ever successfully obtained and sequenced, it will provide a critical window into the genetic diversity that was present in the human family tree prior to 1 million years ago, helping us to better understand the complex evolutionary processes that ultimately led to the extinction of all of these different human species. All except one. On behalf of my research team and field crew in Indonesia, as well as my many colleagues and collaborators here at the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program and elsewhere, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to try and answer any and all questions that you might have. Thank you. Terima kasih and tibateng.
Thank you, Matt. That was a fantastic overview of what we know now about Homo floresiensis. So I think we'll unshare your screen, if you can do that. And then we have several questions already in that will be fun to answer. I'm going to start with, since you talked a little bit at the end about Homo floresiensis or its ancestor maybe arriving earlier. So Mary asked, how would Homo floresiensis have reached Flores Island? And Jenny asked, is it yet known how Homo floresiensis reached the island of Indonesia? Or is that answer only answered if proper preserved ancient DNA is found and sequenced?
Yes, okay, so this is a big question, right? Like, when did they get to the island? How did they get to the island? These are really challenging questions to answer. And, to date, there are a lot of ideas, but no firm answers. For instance, just in general, there's certainly no evidence of any type of intentional watercraft or like boats or anything in this respect. And, probably it's due to a natural dispersal, but that would have evolved crossing a fairly significant amount of open water. Because, as I mentioned, Flores is an oceanic island. It's never been connected to either continent. And what's important to understand here is that we know this because of the other fauna that we see on the island. If it had ever been connected by land to either the Australian continent or the Asian one, we would see a much different collection of terrestrial fauna. And, even like small small little animals, porcupines, civet cats, a number of things, or other marsupials, and there's just no evidence of that. So in general, all the taxa that we find on Flores, not just Homo floresiensis, but all of them, we actually have big questions about, well, how did they even get there? And most likely what's happened is, during the Pleistocene at times of low sea level, a lot of this ocean in this area does drop, and you have sort of greater land areas. So there would have been a little bit closer to Flores, and you probably have some accidental rafting where all surrounding all of these islands are, often mangrove-like forests, where these trees are kind of part in the water, and they're there. And you can go there today and you see like macaques in these things, and all sorts of animals. And when chunks of that break off, they can then get swept to another island, kind of like in a similar way of how New World monkeys got to South America. And so probably what happened at some point in the past, before 1 million years ago, some event like that happened, and managed to land a group of hominins onto Flores. Maybe, yeah, I'll wait. There'll be other questions that are similar, and I'll probably, did I get most of them?
No, that's great. Thank you. Yeah. We have several questions that are sort of asking something similar, so I'll group them all together. So Sarah asked, how many individuals of Homo floresiensis have been found to date? And Sandra said, wonderful. Do you have more than one skeleton? And then we also had a question from an anonymous attendee. Was Homo floresiensis sexually dimorphic?
Oh, yeah. All of these are great questions. Okay, so first of all, like, how many individuals are represented? When these remains were first being discovered, in part due to the misunderstanding of the stratigraphy, it was often reported that there were up to 12 individuals represented. But it's most likely much lower than that, given what we now know about the complexities of the stratigraphy. Essentially, we only have the one partial skeleton, LB1, that has the cranium and then a fair amount of the postcranial skeleton preserved, especially from the hips down. Beyond that, there are at least 2 other adults. And we know this because we have three ulna from the left side. And so no individual has 2 left
one
ulna.
Of the bones up here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the arm bones. And we also have a second jaw, a second lower jaw, the mandible, that has a full set of dentition. And so within that dentition is a premolar that comes right after the canine. So we have that in LB1, the second jaw, as well as an isolated left lower third premolar. So again, a minimum of 3 adults. There are also some juveniles represented, and roughly 2 different ages. And so generally, we haven't yet systematically gone over everything, because there are complexities related to where they're found in the sediments. And again, that minimum of 3 or 4 could actually be, just with the premolars and the ulna, they don't necessarily all have to go together. So there could actually be more individuals represented, but at a minimum, all we can be safe with is saying about 3. And so generally, I use, roughly we have about 5, maybe 6 individuals represented at minimum. Now, where this gets interesting is of these adults that are there, LB1 is the biggest, despite the small size. And the pelvic anatomy of LB1 suggests that she is female. Now, this is using standards that are based on modern human pelvies, and given the distant relationship between humans and hobbits, that may or may not be fully appropriate. But either way, relative to the sexual dimorphism question, this is something that I'm on pins and needles waiting for every time we excavate, because our expectation would be that they're going to be sexually dimorphic in some way. Like even modern humans are sexually dimorphic. But when we go earlier back in the homin record, that the degree and magnitude of that dimorphism increases. And so given, that Homo floresiensis are the descendants from way back earlier in the hominin lineage, they may be really sexually dimorphic. And so in that respect, we could be in for a surprise. We've been going on and on about, we got 1 meter tall hobbits on Flores, but we could easily find a male that if it has a pattern of dimorphism like afarensis, for instance, then the males are going to be 1.5 to 2 times larger than that. And so we're really only 1 bone fragment away from being able to show that definitively. But on the other hand, what if LB1 is male? and maybe these other ones that we found that are slightly smaller are actually the females, and maybe they have a pattern of sexual dimorphism more similar to modern humans. That's another possibility. The other one too that I find fascinating, but I think is probably unlikely, is that, well, what if they all are more monomorphic? We see this in gibbons and siamungs, where males and females are more equal in size, but they're the only examples within the greater hominoid family where we've seen the evolution of that. And there's a lot of behavioral consequences of these changes in dimorphism. And so it could be something that uniquely happened on Flores. But until we find more remains, it will remain unclear. But I'm always got my fingers crossed that we're going to find a skull that's a lot bigger, with, say like a partial sagittal crest, and, there's all sorts of exciting things that could happen. But so far, all we have is the individuals that have been recovered.
Now, I love that we're one bone fragment away from answering another question.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
yeah. So here's a question from Niels. Some animal species found on islands are unusually large. What are your thoughts about why Homo floresiensis are so small?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is obviously a big part of a lot of the narrative about Homo floresiensis. There's these ideas about island dwarfing. Let me just see here if I have a slide that I want to share. I have this with the rats. Maybe I don't have it with the rats, but can I just share this slide while I answer this question?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this idea that animals, above a certain size get smaller on islands, and animals that are below a certain threshold get larger, has been around for a long time. And there are a number of examples of this around the world. But when you dive into the data more closely, it's not really a pattern that explains all of it. In general, these are specific instances that each one really has to be evaluated very closely based off of the actual fossil evidence. And on Flores, for instance, the main evidence for dwarfing of an animal comes from the elephant, the stegodon, that's shown here, where the stegodon that are at Liangbua are roughly about 30% smaller, at least in tooth size, from what is thought to be their ancestor about 800,000 years ago on Flores. And so there's an example of this elephant getting smaller. And elephants have done this around the world. They've dwarfed on numerous occasions. It's a bit more complicated though, because also on Flores, in even older sediments, older than 1 million years old, there's even a smaller proboscidean that sometimes disappears. And so, the connections between all of these taxa have to be firmly established if we're going to accept that they're actually getting smaller. But at least with the proboscideans, we have evidence from elsewhere that we know that this is reasonable, right? They really seem to follow the island rule. These other taxa, however, don't. Like Komodo dragons initially were often thought to be island giants, right? That maybe they got bigger, but actually the fossil record on Flores, as well as comparatively broader, going all the way back, all the way across to Australia and into Asia, shows that these Komodo dragons on Flores have not changed 1 iota in size over their entire representation on the island, which goes from over 1 million years ago up until now. So they haven't changed. The giant stork in the Pliocene, so older than 2.5 million years ago, giant storks were a lot more common across Asia. And so there are questions about whether or not the stork actually got bigger on the island. It may actually be the same size as when its ancestors arrived on the island. The rats are another taxa that's often used. Let me just, sorry, I'll see if I have a picture. Yeah, here we go. Okay, like when I say giant, I'm not just, doing a Princess Bride thing. Like these are really big rats. And so it's thought, oh yeah, these rats must have got big on Flores. But actually, throughout all of these oceanic islands in Southeast Asia, giant rats are relatively common, and there's sort of a big radiation, and there's no fossil evidence yet on Flores that shows any change in size of any of these rat taxa. In other words, they look pretty similar to what they might have looked like when they arrived. So within that context, right, I just think we need to be a lot more careful with trying to rush to an explanation that we think, oh, there's a pattern out there with some taxa. Must explain Homo floresiensis. It may be the case, but I think, again, we're really only a bone fragment away from demonstrating it, right? Like at some of the older sites on Flores that date between 700,000 and 1 million years ago, all they need to find is a femoral head or a part of a humerus that would immediately show us, if it was larger, that maybe there is some type of dwarfing that's occurred. So otherwise, though, the body size is pretty similar to what we see in early hominins, 2 to 4 to 5 million years ago. So maybe they're just unchanged. But these are the main things that we need more evidence to try and resolve between these alternative explanations.
Nice, thank you for laying that out really clearly. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions that are more about the people living in the area today, because I know you've done so much work with the local communities.
Oh,
so yeah. Neil asked, is it true that some living Indonesians have legends referring to little people that might originate in their ancestors' knowledge of these hobbits? And there are two other related questions. Vale asked, hi, how do the native populations and local communities feel about these discoveries? Do they feel them as ancestors, although there's no record that they have survived to the present day? And Chen asked, how do local people in Flores feel about this great discovery? And what might their reaction to this idea that there were more than one species of human living in their island in the past?
Yeah, no, great questions. I mean, first I'll start, I guess, are there legends about small people? And there are, but not in all of the groups that lived on Flores. Flores is quite diverse. There's a number of different ethnic groups that have their own individual histories. Most of them are Austronesian in descent, meaning that they're part of this Austronesian language family, which is basically one of the last prehistoric dispersals of our species within the past 5,000 years or so within these larger areas of island Southeast Asia. The issue is that in some of the groups on Flores that have some of these legends, in particular, there's this one called Ibu Gogo, and there's been a lot written about it in relation to Homo floresiensis. The main issue is that it's not very specific, right? It's, in Ireland, we've got leprechauns, right? And so these ideas are around, and in Austronesian language generally, so not just on Flores, but throughout the larger area, there are similar legends like this. And so, whether it actually applies to a hominin species or just applies to legends that arise from seeing non-human primates at like dusk and dawn or things like that, when lighting, play tricks, there's lots of ways that these things could sort of develop. Early on, when Homo floresiensis was discovered, and it was thought to be up to 18 to 13,000 years ago, there was at least a possibility in this case that, okay, modern humans, we may have overlapped in time on the island because modern humans reached Australia 50,000 years ago. So there was no Qantas Airlines to get you across. Like if you were getting to Australia, you were coming through these islands at some point. And so in that case, there was certainly enough time, but another complication there, like I mentioned, the groups that live on Flores today are Austronesian. And so they arrived on the island within the past 3,000 years, right? Although we know there were modern humans there before, they are more closely related to Australo-Melanesian populations, so like Aboriginal Australians and Aboriginal Papuans. And those languages don't have any of these legends. So again, there's some interesting ideas, and you can think about them and imagine over a beer or a coffee or something, but actually connecting them to be where we can actually feel confident that these might be related is pretty difficult. In the second case, like, how do the local people feel about Homo floresiensis? Well, obviously, not all people on Flores feel the same way as everybody else. Like, there's a wide variety of opinions, just like, if we were to poll people that are here today or, in Washington, D.C. or wherever. But overall, generally, they're very positive. Like, for instance, Liang Bua is a big part of the local tourism. And so on Flores, so we regularly have tourists. Like, when we're there excavating on a daily basis, we have people coming. I mean, it's just nonstop. And not only from Flores, but from around Indonesia and from around the world. Obviously, we're not excavating now during the pandemic, but before that was the case. And so, we regularly have school groups come in, especially high school students that are focusing on tourism as a potential career, come and spend a day or two with us at the cave. And now we even have some children of even our local workers who many of them, didn't have the opportunities to go to school. And they work, farming the land and working odd jobs, and they work for us. Many of them have children now that are now going to university and doing archaeology because they've grown up with that connection and realizing that, wow, there are ways that we can know about our past. Early on, because of, obviously I didn't touch on it that much in the presentation, but many of you are probably aware, after the initial discovery, there was a several-year period of a very acrimonious debate about these remains and whether do they represent an early hominin or are they just a modern human with some type of disease or growth abnormality. And that those competing hypotheses or narratives, if you will, certainly had an effect, even on local populations, because they would, depends on what people have been exposed to. So oftentimes we do still have people that come in thinking that these are just the remains of modern humans and potentially are their ancestors. But on the larger side, the team, the families that we work with there, and then the outreach that we do on the island, most now recognize that Homo floresiensis is sort of equally related to all of us. It's not their ancestor on the island, and it's not my ancestor, but we're equally related to it, just like we're equally related to chimpanzees and bonobos. So generally, overall, very supportive, and they're always very enthusiastic about Homo floresiensis.
Excellent, thank you. Here's one of those sort of unanswerable questions, but I think things that we wrestle with as paleoanthropologists. So Joseph asked, how did Homo floresiensis go extinct? They're on an island by themselves without competition. Could it have been predators? But wouldn't the predators have been small due to insular dwarfing? Was it probably climate change?
Yeah. Oh, this is these are the $64 million questions. I mean, I just hope that, like, before I die, that we'll have part of the answer to some of these big questions. Like, what are they what other early hominins are they most closely related to? How did they get to the island? Why did they go extinct? With the why did they go extinct, this is sort of it's a deep question, right? Because obviously it seems pretty clear that Homo floresiensis was around on this planet during the same time as our species. So, like, our species originates 300 to 400,000 years in Africa. Within the last 50 to 70,000 years, we've basically spread all over the globe. And now are even contemplating, like, getting people to Mars, or setting up colonies on the moon. Like, I mean, talking about dispersal. And, for a long time, we thought we were alone, right? Or, obviously we've known about Neanderthals, but Neanderthals are a lot more similar to us in terms of their anatomy, the behavior, and obviously there's been a long debate over how do we consider them a different species or not. And, obviously we know we interbred, and those of us of Eurasian descent have about 2% on average of our genome is Neanderthal in origin. So, there's a close connection there with Neanderthals and Denisovans. But Homo floresiensis is obviously even more distant to that, and yet they're the descendants of this lineage that was still around. So like we shared the planet with them, just like chimpanzees and bonobos share the world, right? So trying to figure out why they went extinct, I think, is very important, you know, just even for us as a species to understand what happened, because, you know, it could happen to us, right? I know it seems far-fetched and everything, but I think, like, I remember giving a similar talk as this last year before the pandemic, and just trying to underscore how at risk we are as a species, given our lack of genetic diversity. You know, that we are prone to, you know, events like this, even though it seemed like it came out of the blue or not. It's not necessarily as surprising as many of us might have thought. You know, the evidence is there. And so with Homo floresiensis, obviously being on this isolated island in many instances probably enabled them to survive longer than if there were pockets of similar hominins living within the Asian mainland, which I would suspect were probably there. We just haven't found evidence of them yet. You know, they would have been essentially competing directly with Denisovans and or Neanderthals and or even modern humans at some point. And when you have closely related species, right, we like the same foods. We like the same things, right? If one species has some sort of competitive advantage in terms of how they extract or obtain those resources, even if there's never any direct conflict, there's going to be a big demographic difference, and one lineage is going to disappear and the other is going to replace, even if there's no direct, you know, head-on, you know, hominin to hominin conflict.
So actually, oh, go ahead. I was going to say this leads me to a couple more questions, but go ahead.
Okay. So if we think of Homo floresiensis here on the island, right now, there's no evidence of modern humans being on the island at the same time. We have the first evidence of modern humans on Flores is also at Liangbua, and it's roughly 46,000 years ago. You know, that's only a 4,000-year window between when the Hobbits seem to disappear and modern humans show up. Maybe we've made some mistakes in that day. Maybe it's a little bit bigger or whatever, but there's at least, we don't have that overlap yet. But it's really close, right? And again, one fragment away. But just as an example, like if modern humans reached Flores, you know, what would happen to Stegodon? You know, almost certainly Stegodon, which has lived without, you know, only having Komodo dragon as a predator, which is very different than a mammalian predator. In many cases, the Komodo dragon is just going to wait for the things to die and then scavenge. You know, there's a good possibility that modern humans would simply wipe everything out very fast, right? And you could see that it would, if modern humans reached Flores when Homo floresiensis was still around, just through this competitive exclusion ideas, Homo floresiensis would be in trouble. But nonetheless, there's also a number of other things going on during this period in the Pleistocene, when around the world you've got big changes in temperatures and climates, and all large mammals are kind of at risk, right? Especially them if they're slowly reproducing. And because of these events, together with the possibility of modern humans coming in, I think these things just come together, and then, you know, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. Volcanism by itself, I don't know. I've always sort of laughed and chuckled at that because it gets said a lot. But like Flores is a volcanic island. It only exists because these oceanic volcanoes are spewing out stuff and they've formed an island. They continue to do that to this day. And so throughout the million years that Homo floresiensis was potentially on the island, the volcanoes have been going off right, left, and center. And that, you know, I'm sure locally in certain areas, this is, you know, caused a few to be wiped out, but not overall as the species. So I think it's sort of a complicated question, but the combination of a few major even volcanoes from outside of Flores, like the Toba eruption, for instance, and its effects, coupled with climate change of the Pleistocene, and then the possibility of modern humans. These are probably the causes.
So like a combination of causes tends to be, yeah.
Probably, but we don't know. And again, yeah. I think what we need to find out for ourselves is, did our species really play a role?
Yeah.
And we need to understand. We need to understand that we may well have. It's
Yeah.
an unfortunate thing to contemplate.
So let me pivot to another question since you mentioned food. A couple people have asked, Claudia asked, what did the dental structure suggest about their diet? And that was part of her question. And then Imogene asked, did the Hobbits hunt and eat those animals you mentioned?
Yeah, no, these are questions that we're still, actively really trying to figure out. In essence, the sediments in which we find Homo floresiensis remains are full of stegodon remains, this extinct elephant. But we basically find all these remains jumbled up together. The stork, Komodo dragon, the stegodon, the hobbit bones. They're just bones that have ended up accumulating on the surface, and they're together. And then we have like tens and tens of thousands of stone artifacts all mixed in. Now, in the old days, like sometimes I wish like it was 50 years ago, I could just sit here and say, emphatically with no doubt that the tools there in association with the bones are enough to say that these hominins were hunting these stegodon and very successfully doing that. Now as Briana, knows as an expert in taphonomy and these processes that happen after death, we realize that we have to be a lot more careful in constructing these narratives without really strong evidence to back them up. Those bones could easily have been put down in one season, and in the next season, the stone tools come in there, and they're just ended up being mixed, so that when we look at it 50,000 years in the future, it just sort of looks like they happened simultaneously. And to date, of all the stegodon remains, which I think at last count is well over 10,000 bone fragments, I think only 2 show any clear sign of what we might think is a stone tool cut mark, but even they are a bit questionable. And so it does raise some serious questions about, why are they there together? And I think if we take a more broader view and we look, okay, well, we've got this marabou stork. Actually, let me bring that slide up again. Oh, this one would be nice. Here, let me do this. This is a drawing that Grace Veach did, and she's doing her dissertation on the taphonomy right now of the small rats, and she's going to be coming to the Smithsonian to do a postdoc where she'll be focusing on expanding this research into the stegodon remains. But essentially, we have something like this, right? We've got this large herbivore that is surrounded by these other large animals. And I want to remind you, these are the only animals, like the stegodon, the giant stork, the vulture, the Komodo dragon, and the hobbits. These are the only animals on Flores in the past that are larger than about 3 or 4 kilograms. Okay, like there's no evidence of anything else at Liangbua during this time. And so, if we think of these, what do storks and vultures do? Well, they're scavengers, right? And Komodo dragons, okay, yeah, they can go and they can take a bite out of something and get their venom, their poison and bacteria into the animal, and then they just sit back and track the animal for a few days and wait for it to die, and then they go in. And so in many ways, it sort of looks like we've got a large herbivore that then has a scavenging guild, right? A group of animals that are kind of all getting access to the carcass at different times. We don't really see any evidence, even from the skeletal elements that are preserved of the stegodon. We've got lots and lots of craniodental remains of these proboscideans. Now, if these hobbits were hunting these stegodon successfully out on the landscape, they wouldn't be chopping the heads off and then carrying them all the way back to the cave. There's just the amount of energy that would take, we would see a different representation of the elements within Liangbua. And so in this way, it doesn't look like hobbits had first access to these carcasses. They may well have come in after the fact and then, broke open bones and got at the marrow, which is something that hominins sort of start doing 2 to 3 million years ago, sort of taking over this open niche that's there that maybe only hyenas might do in Africa, and obviously there's nothing doing that on Flores. And so I think the most conservative interpretation is to see that Homo floresiensis is probably opportunistically scavenging stegodon, and otherwise probably taking advantage of regular resources that hominins would have always gone after, which is like fruits and other plant foods, and possibly smaller animals like the rats would have probably made up part of their diet. But again, in terms of definitive evidence on any of this, we don't. This is about all we've got so far, and so we need a lot more detailed analyses to sort of confirm or reject some of these ideas about what Homo floresiensis might have been eating.
So thank you. So we've gotten a couple of questions about evolutionary relationships in Homo floresiensis, but I'll ask this one from B. Wood, perhaps Bernard, who said, "Great talk."
Oh, Bob Wood, I'm sure.
How do you think the small hominins discovered on Luzon are related to Homo floresiensis?
Oh yeah, great question. Well, I think, this is where I as a person who was in graduate school when Homo floresiensis was discovered, and then, while I was at the Smithsonian, I got the opportunity to start working on some of the remains, and I've become increasingly involved in the research. I was always excited, like back when I said that, wow, what a wonderful time to be alive, is partly because I just sort of thought, wow, it wasn't the discovery itself, but it was the implications of what it meant we were probably missing. Like, if this thing is what some of the scientists at the time thought it was, and what many of us do now, it just means that, all of Eurasia is just like, there's got to be stuff just waiting to be found. And so in some ways, some of the criticisms at the time were like, hey, we have no biogeographical evidence of anything else like this. It just can't be. And, I always sort of thought of it, well, okay, it's a prediction. Like, if Homo floresiensis is what some scientists think it is, then the prediction is we're going to start finding other taxa that are also, more distantly related to us than we are to Neanderthals, and we'll see, and we'll start seeing them survive up until more recent times. And so, like, Homo floresiensis sort of broke the internet at the time when it was discovered, in part because it was the first one that did this, and it just was so extreme, it just, blew the doors wide open. But since then, we've got Homo naledi, an example of this, not even on an island, right, in Africa, and now Homo luzonensis on the Philippines. And so Homo luzonensis is a really special case because there's so many parallels with Flores. So, for instance, on Flores, there are old stone artifacts, right, like that date between 700,000 and even slightly older than 1 million years ago. And on Luzon in the Philippines, you also have this deep archaeological record. And for instance, there's a butchered, if I remember correctly, butchered rhinoceros that's about 750,000 years old on Luzon. Now, again, hey, stone artifacts, or cut marks and this kind of behavior, we were not expecting to see on these oceanic islands. And then lo and behold, now we have some skeletal remains that are at least 50,000 years old. It's based on uranium series dating, which is problematic because you only really have a minimum age. They could be 150,000 years old, but they're at least 50,000. And there's parallels with Homo floresiensis. It's got the small teeth that are more like the genus Homo, and yet there's some hand and foot remains. And the hand and foot remains look almost like you could pull them out of the assemblage at Hadar, which is like between 3 and 3.4 million years ago in East Africa, the assemblage for Australopithecus afarensis. Now, you know, it's scrappy evidence, right? You've got some fragments of teeth and a couple hand and foot bones. But it's similar enough, I see, in terms of the pattern to what we see with Homo floresiensis. We've got clearly a Homo-like face and jaw, juxtaposed with a very primitive hominin, like afarensis-like postcrania, maybe with a few subtle distinctions. And so, wow, now we see this on Luzon, and yet not exactly like Homo floresiensis, like it's distinct enough, but to me it suggests that there's probably some relationship between these two, either that they share an ancestor between them and that they are, you know, independent divergencies from that common ancestor, and, you know, or and that, you know, whenever this ancestor may have got across the Wallace line, we then may have, if they are related in this way, then it means that all of these islands are open for business, if you will, in terms of potentially showing us another example of this. So I think it's really exciting times in this way for paleoanthropology in this part of the world.
Nice.
You know, on one hand, none of them are, you know, they're not our ancestors, so it loses
Right.
some of that effect. But in terms of seeing how evolution can affect and impact hominins in a lineage, it's really exciting. So my guess would be that luzonensis is somehow related closely with Homo floresiensis. But we'll see.
Nice, thank you. So I know we're just past time, but I want to squeeze one more question in quickly because I think it's a great question. In part because yesterday we celebrated the 11th anniversary of the opening of the Hall of Human Origins on March 17, 2010.
That's right.
And so somebody asked a Hall of Human Origins related question. They said,
yes, that's me. That's my picture. I was a lot younger then.
So, and since you were working with us in the Human Origins program while we were designing this exhibit, they said, I've noticed that the Homo floresiensis replica in the M&H Hall of Human Origins is wearing a ring in homage to the Lord of the Rings. Were you the mastermind behind this exhibit Easter egg? Is that an I'll never tell face? Is that your answer?
Yeah. Who's asking this?
Someone who's an anonymous attendee.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'll divulge. Yeah, that was all me. I take full blame for that.
Can you just briefly, quickly before we end, describe what that ring looks like or how you did it?
Yeah. So I just I mean, it sort of comes to this. You know, I remember at the time, you know, there was a lot of, you know, debate among scientists, like, oh, it's not, you know, can we call it the Hobbit, or, you know, and there's always been a certain amount of back and forth on this. And I think I always just really liked the idea because it's such a positive label, if you will. Like if you think of Neanderthal, right? It's so easy. People, and we just had this example in the US in politics where, you know, there's in the news talking about Neanderthal and what it means. But generally, like, people often have a negative connotation to it. They see it as some sort of, you know, an insult, even though it shouldn't be that way, but it's just through the history of the science that it's that aspect has evolved. But Hobbit has none of that, negative connotation, right? And so to describe to people that may not have a lot of knowledge about human evolution, they immediately recognize it as something, you know, recognizable as human, but just different in its own special way. And so I always really liked the idea that they had been nicknamed the Hobbits. And so when we were putting those reconstructions together, I was working with Paul Reimer, and we were putting all the bones together. And I said to him, I said, I think I want to sneak a ring on it. And he really liked it. And he said, have you talked to Rick Potts about it? I said, no, I haven't. I don't want to ask him because he might say no. And so we went ahead and he said, okay, well, I said, what can we do? And we were using, for that part of the skeleton, because of the 3D prints were so small, these were just the small hand bones, we weren't using big brackets. We were actually just using very thin wire that was firm enough that would hold the weight. And so what we did is we just took a little bit extra of the wire and we wrapped it around the finger bone and put it there, and then didn't tell anyone, and just left it. And then it was just sort of our little secret that we had put the one ring.
So for everybody, when we open back up and you can come visit our exhibit, we would love for you to take a look for the ring. So I just want to thank Matt so much for this presentation. There have been some wonderful, thank yous in the Q&A, and I'm sorry we had so many questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the NMNH Video Webinars archive. It will also be posted on the Human Origins website. And please join us next month on April 15th, Dr. Audrey Lin, who's a paleogeneticist, and Peter Buck, postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History, National Museum of Natural History, will share her research on dog domestication and the prehistory of humans' best friends. So thank you again, Matt, and we look forward to hearing more about Homo floresiensis in the future and seeing you next month and seeing the audience next month. Thanks so much. Bye.